Welcome back, everyone. Tonight's video is about something that seems harmless, even relaxing, until it goes terribly wrong. House sitting. You are alone in someone else's home, responsible for their property, their pets, and their peace of mind. But what happens when the house itself does not want you there? These are 3 true house-sitting horror stories, based on real experiences shared by people who swore they would never do it again. Let's begin with the first one. Story 1. The empty house on Willow Creek. Was 26 when this happened, broke and between jobs. My cousin Laura called one afternoon and asked if I wanted to make some extra cash. She said her boss was going on vacation for 2 weeks and needed someone to house sit his property on the outskirts of town. I had nothing better to do, so I said yes. The house was on Willow Creek Road, an older place built in the late 70s, surrounded by pine trees and farmland. Laura told me the owner, Mr. Henderson, was particular about things. Keep the lights on in the front room at night, feed his cat twice a day, and never open the basement door. I laughed when she said that last part, thinking she was joking, but she insisted. He means it, she told me.
He said the basement's off limits. I arrived that Friday evening.
The sun was setting behind the trees, throwing long shadows across the gravel driveway. The house looked normal, a little dated but clean. When I stepped inside, it smelled faintly of lemon polish and old carpet. On the kitchen counter, there was a note from Mr. Henderson. It listed the cat's feeding schedule, his phone number, and at the bottom again, do not go into the basement. The cat, a gray tabby named Milo, rubbed against my leg as if to welcome me. I set my bag in the guest room upstairs, made some coffee, and settled in for the night. Around midnight, I turned off the TV and started heading to bed when I heard it, a faint thump coming from below the floor. It sounded like something dropping onto concrete. Milo's ears perked up and he stared toward the basement door. I figured it might be the pipes, maybe the water heater, but when it happened again, slower this time, it made the hair on my arms rise. I told myself it was nothing and went to bed. The next morning, I fed Milo and decided to look around the property. Behind the house was a small shed, locked with a rusted padlock. The yard sloped down to a creek, and the trees blocked most of the sun. It was quiet, too quiet. When I came back inside, I noticed the basement door was slightly open. I was sure I had left it shut. A cold draft crept through the gap, carrying that damp, earthy smell you get from places that have not been aired out in years. I closed it gently and locked it. That night, the noises returned. Soft knocks at first, then a dragging sound like something heavy being moved across the floor beneath me. Milo paced in circles, tail puffed up, eyes fixed on the door. I turned up the volume on my laptop to drown it out. Around 2 a.m., I heard the doorknob rattle. Just once, then silence. The next morning, I called Laura. I asked if her boss had mentioned anything strange about the house. She hesitated before saying, "He told me once he does not like staying there alone. Said his wife used to hear things after dark." "His wife?" I asked. "Yeah," Laura said quietly. "She died there. Years ago. He never talks about it." I didn't know what to say. I almost packed my things right then, but the money was good and I didn't want to look like a coward. That night, the power went out. I lit a candle and sat on the couch. Milo curled up beside me when I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate, I froze. My phone flashlight shook as I pointed it toward the staircase. No one there. The air felt thick, heavy, like the whole house was holding its breath. The footsteps started again, this time behind me, coming from the hallway near the guest room. I forced myself to move, checking every room. Empty. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw the basement door. It was wide open. The smell hit me first. Damp concrete and something faintly metallic like old rust or blood. I called out, "Hello, Mr. Henderson?" Even though I knew he was out of state. I took a step closer and shined the light down the stairs. The beam barely reached the bottom. Something moved, just a flicker, and I heard a soft voice whisper my name. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut and jamming a chair under the handle. I stayed awake until dawn, too scared to blink. When morning came, I packed my bags. I called Laura and told her I was done, money or not. She said she understood. Before I left, I wrote a note for Mr. Henderson explaining the power outage and that I had kept everything secure. As I walked out, I realized Milo was missing. I searched the house, calling his name, but he was gone. The basement door was open again. I could not leave him, so I crept down the stairs, heart pounding. The air grew colder the farther I went. At the bottom, the light flickered off the concrete walls. There were old shelves, boxes, and a single wooden chair in the middle of the floor. Milo sat under it, staring at the far corner. When I followed his gaze, I saw a door, smaller, like a storage room. It was nailed shut, fresh nails. On the wood, someone had written in faded ink, "Do not open." I turned, ready to leave, but something inside that little room scratched against the wall. Once, then again. Milo hissed and bolted up the stairs. I did not look back. When I reached the top, the basement door slammed on its own, nearly catching my foot. I ran outside, started my car, and never returned. A week later, Laura called me. She said Mr. Henderson was upset. Not because I left early, but because I had disturbed the basement. I told her I never touched anything. She went quiet, then said, "He told me he boarded that inner door years ago, after they found her down there." "Found who?" I asked. "His wife," Laura whispered. "She hung herself in that room. He said sometimes he still hears her walking around at night." I never took another house-sitting job again, and that is when I realized the house had never been empty. Story 2, the neighbor across the street. Last summer, I agreed to house-sit for my old literature professor, Mrs. Callahan. She was 72, widowed, and sweet as anyone could be. She lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, a place where people still waved to each other from their driveways. She was flying to Florida to visit her sister for a week and offered me $500 to stay at her home, water the plants, and collect the mail. It sounded like the easiest money ever. Her house was small but cozy. Lace curtains, old furniture, shelves full of books. Everything smelled faintly of lavender and coffee. On the first night, I ordered takeout, watched a movie, and slept in the guest room. Nothing unusual happened. The second day, I noticed something strange. Across the street in the house directly opposite, there was a man standing behind the front window. He was tall, pale, and just stood there staring. At first, I thought maybe he was curious about me being new, but after 5 minutes, I realized he was not moving. He did not wave, did not step away, he just watched. I tried to ignore it. I closed the curtains and went on with my evening, but every time I peeked outside, he was still there, frozen, facing the house. That night, as I got ready for bed, I noticed something else. The motion light in Mrs. Callahan's backyard turned on by itself. I looked through the blinds. Nothing there, just the faint glow on the garden. Then I saw a shape move quickly across the yard and disappear behind the fence. I stayed awake for hours listening. The house creaked like old bones, and every small sound made me flinch. The next morning, I decided to call Mrs. Callahan to ask about the man across the street. She laughed lightly and said, "Oh, that's probably old Mr. Harrington. He's blind, dear. Lost his sight 10 years ago." My stomach sank. Blind? Then what was he looking at? That night, the motion light flicked on again, this time twice. I looked out and saw the gate to the backyard slightly open. I was sure I had latched it earlier. I went outside with a flashlight, scanning the fence line, nothing. But when I turned around, the curtain in the living room window was moving, like someone had just stepped away from it. I rushed inside, heart pounding, checking every door and window. Locked. I convinced myself it must have been the wind and went to bed with the bedroom door locked. At around 3 a.m., a soft knock woke me. 3 slow taps on the front door. I froze. No one should be visiting at that hour. The knocking came again. This time a little louder. I tiptoed down the hall, grabbed my phone, and quietly peeked through the peephole. At first I saw nothing, just the empty porch. Then slowly a shadow shifted at the edge of the light. Someone was standing to the side, out of view. I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer. I stepped back, heart racing. Then through the peephole I saw a hand, pale, long fingers, slide over the glass as if feeling for something. I called 911. The operator told me to stay inside and keep the doors locked. When the police arrived 10 minutes later, there was no one there. But the gate was wide open again, and there were fresh footprints leading from the backyard to the front porch. The next day, I told Mrs. Callahan what happened. She sounded shaken but said she would call her neighbor to check the security cameras. A few hours later, she called me back, her voice trembling. "There is something wrong with those cameras," she said. "They froze at exactly 2:58 a.m., right before the light came on." The police took a report but said there was no evidence of a break-in. I tried to stay calm for the next few nights, but I barely slept. On the 5th night, I woke up to a faint humming sound coming from the living room. When I walked out, I realized it was the old landline phone, off the hook, buzzing softly. I had not touched it. I hung it up, turned around, and froze. Through the front window, that same man was standing across the street again, watching. Only this time he was closer to the glass, and close enough that I could see his eyes, and they were open, not cloudy, not blind. I yanked the curtain shut and ran back to the guest room, shaking. I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. They said the house across the street had been empty for over a year. Empty. The next morning, I packed my things and left before the sun was even up. When Mrs. Callahan came back a few days later, she told me something that made my blood run cold. Her previous house sitter, a teenage boy, had quit halfway through the week. He claimed someone kept knocking on the door at night and calling his name from the backyard. When I asked who had lived in the house across the street before it was abandoned, she said, "A man named Harrington. He died there last summer." Now every time I pass that neighborhood, I glance at the windows and sometimes I swear I still see him standing there, waiting. Story 3. The hidden room upstairs. In 2019, I agreed to house sit for a couple named the Millers. They were distant relatives of my mother. Nice people who owned a large 2-story house about an hour outside the city. It was quiet, surrounded by trees, and the closest neighbor was half a mile away. They were traveling to Europe for 2 weeks and just needed someone to look after their pets and keep the place from looking empty. The moment I walked in, I noticed how still the house felt. It was clean, but it had that kind of silence that makes your ears ring. No hum of traffic. No city noise, just the soft ticking of a wall clock. The Millers had a cat named Willow and an old golden retriever named Max. They were friendly and easy to handle, so the first few days were peaceful. I worked remotely from the dining table, went for walks with Max, and watched TV at night. Everything felt fine until the 4th night. That night I woke up around 2 a.m. to what sounded like footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate creaks, one after another, right above the ceiling of the guest bedroom. I assumed maybe it was the cat exploring, but when I turned on the bedside lamp, Willow was curled up beside my feet, sleeping soundly. The footsteps stopped. I got out of bed, grabbed my phone, and walked through the hallway, looking up toward the ceiling. There was an attic door in the hallway, one of those square ones with a pull string. It looked untouched, thick with dust around the edges. I shook the thought off, assuming it must be the old house settling, and went back to bed. The next day was normal, but that night the same thing happened again. Only this time the footsteps lasted longer, slow pacing back and forth above the room, then a dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I could not ignore the feeling that someone, or something, was moving around up there. The next morning I decided to check the attic. I pulled down the door, unfolded the ladder, and climbed up with a flashlight. The air was stale and cold. Dust floated in the beam of light. The attic looked empty, just old boxes, a broken rocking chair, and some Christmas decorations. But then I noticed something strange at the far end, a small wooden door half my height, built into the wall. It had a tiny padlock on it. I called Mr. Miller to ask about it, but he just laughed and said, "Oh, that? It's probably just an old crawl space. We never use it." That night the sounds came again, louder this time. At one point I could swear I heard a muffled thud, then what sounded like breathing, slow and uneven, directly above my room. I barely slept. On the 7th night, things escalated. Around 1:30 a.m., Max started growling at the ceiling, his fur standing up. Willow hissed and bolted out of the room. Then came a loud bang from upstairs, like someone had dropped something heavy. I grabbed a kitchen knife and climbed the attic ladder, heart pounding. When I reached the top, the air was freezing. I shined the flashlight toward the little door, and the padlock was gone. It was open. The door hung slightly ajar, and from the darkness beyond it came a faint, rotten smell. I called out, "Hello?" But there was no answer, only the sound of the wind through the trees outside. I moved closer and nudged the small door open with my foot. The beam of light revealed a narrow crawl space that extended deeper than I expected. Inside there were blankets, a small flashlight, and several empty food cans. Someone had been living in there. Then, from the shadows inside, something shifted. I saw the flash of movement, and two eyes looking straight back at me. I stumbled backward down the ladder, almost falling, and slammed the attic door shut. I ran outside with Max and called the police. They arrived within 15 minutes, searched the attic, and found no one. But the officer said the crawl space showed signs of someone staying there recently. Flattened blankets, open cans, and footprints in the dust leading to a small vent that opened to the roof. They suspected it might have been a homeless man using the attic for shelter. After that night, I refused to stay there. The Millers came home early and thanked me for letting the police know. A few weeks later, Mrs. Miller called to tell me something disturbing. The police had found a man hiding in an abandoned shed about a mile from their property. He had a backpack with several of the Millers' belongings inside. When they arrested him, he told them he had been living in their attic for months, sneaking down at night for food. But what still haunts me is what Mrs. Miller said last. She asked the police when they thought he left the attic. They said, "Judging by the dust and footprints, it looked like he was still there while I was sleeping below him. And maybe, even while I was on that ladder, he was still inside that crawl space, watching me." Thank you for watching and for making it to the end of tonight's stories. House sitting always sounds easy, until the house itself starts to feel alive. Whether it is the quiet creaks, the shadow in the hallway, or the face staring back through the window, sometimes the scariest things happen when we think we are completely alone. If you have ever experienced something strange while house sitting, or anywhere you were supposed to be alone, share your story in the comments below. I might feature it in a future video. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications because there are many more true horror stories coming soon. Sleep well tonight. If you can,